Welcome to the next installment of coding videos. Today we're going to be doing another LeetCode easy problem. Today's problem is called number of students doing homework at a given time. And this is actually a pretty cool problem, so let's check it out. So, given two integer arrays, start time and end time, and given an integer query time, the ith student started doing their homework at the time start time I, and finished it at the time end time I. Return the number of students doing their homework at time query time. More formally, return the number of students where query time lays in the interval start time I, end time I, inclusive. So it's got to be in between those two times. Inclusive, so it can be either of these times as well. So looking at example 1, we have the first student started at 1 and ended at 3. Second student started at 2, ended at 2, and third student started at 3 and ended at 7. The query time was 4. So looking at this, the only student who had a query time of 4 was a student who started at 3 and ended at 7. Because the other two students, these first two students, did not actually study during the query time of 4. So the output would be 1. Explanation, we have 3 students, where the first student started doing homework at time 1 and finished at time 3 and wasn't doing anything at time 4. The second student started doing homework at time 2 and finished at time 2 and wasn't doing anything at time 4. The third student started at time 3, finished at time 7, and was the only student doing homework at time 4. So they're going to be the only reason we have an output of 1. Example 2, we have one student here. They started at 4, they ended at 4, and their query time was 4. So our output's going to be 1. Example 3, our start time was 4, our end time was 4, and the query time was 5. That means that there was that only student there was not studying during 5, and so the output would be 0. Example 4, start time would for all 4 students was at 1, and then their end times was 1, 3, 2, and 4. The query time was 7, and none of those students had a study time during 7, so the output was 0. Finally, the start time is 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The end time is 10 o'clock for all of them, or 10 for all of them, and the query time was 5. The only ones that have 5 or above are these 5 students, and so the output would be 5. Okay. Oh, sorry, actually it would be these 5 students. Apologies for that. Okay, so constraints. Start time dot length is going to be equal to the end time dot length, so those are going to be the same things. We're not going to have any more numbers in this array than this array. They're going to be the same amount of numbers. I is going to be less than or equal to start time dot length, 1, and start time dot length is going to be less than or equal to 100. So that's going to be start time dot length. So the amount of students is going to be between 1 and 100. Start time and end time can be anywhere from 1 to 1,000. So these individual integers here can be anywhere from 1 to 1,000. And the query time over here, this integer can be anywhere from 1 to 1,000. Okay, so down here I've written up our class. Our class is just the name of the problem, number of students doing homework at a given time. We have our method here that we're going to solve in. This is this busy student method. It returns an integer, and it takes 3 parameters, as we saw above in the examples. We have the array of start times for the students, the array of end times for the students, and the integer query time, telling us what time we're querying. And then we have our main method down here, which we'll test in. So looking at this problem, the first thing that really strikes me, and looking at this example up here, is that these outputs are basically counters. We're counting each time one of these students in the arrays has a query time of 4. So for example, down here, this one student has a start time of 4 and an end time of 4, and so in the query time of 4, and so that counter is going to be 1, or the output. So we can start by creating a counter down here. We're going to set it to 0, so we're going to assign it to 0. Now, I think the easiest way to solve this is actually to create a second method. And in that second method, which we'll call in this first method, we will just take an individual student. So we'll look at an individual student from both of these start times and end time, and then we'll take the query time and we'll see, hey, did this student study during that query time? And that way we don't have to look at the whole array of students. We can just look at one individually per time. So we're going to do that by doing a for loop, a for I loop. We're going to set I equal to 0, so I initialized at 0. The conditional here is going to be I less than start time or end time dot length, because remember up here we noticed that they are the exact same anyway, so you could do either start time dot length or end time dot length here. So now we're going to iterate through these arrays, these two arrays, and we're going to do something. We're going to say if, and right here we're going to call a method called isBetween. Now I have not written this method yet, but we're going to call this method with start time, end time, and query time. And actually what we're going to do here is, and I'll explain this in just a second. So we're taking just the ith element, so one of the elements from start time and the same student element basically from end time. So we're going to take 9 from here and the corresponding element over here, 10. So 9 and 10. We're going to input those two elements into this isBetween argument with the query time, and we're going to check, is it between? So we can do that outside of this method. So we're going to go outside this method, and we're going to create a second method here. This method can be private. It's going to return a Boolean. It's going to tell us if the query time is between these two numbers. So this Boolean is going to be called isBetween. It's going to take 3 parameters, int start time, int end time, and query time. So notice this method here looks very similar to our method up above, except for this method in terms of the signature. But the parameters up here are both integer arrays, and these two parameters are just ints. So we're just taking single individual integers from those integers arrays and plugging them into this method down here. So, and sorry, this is going to be an int query time. Okay, so looking at this, we're going to run another for loop. And in this for loop, we're going to start it at I, or at the start time, sorry. So we're going to end it at the end time. So I less than or equal to the end time, because remember we're going inclusive here. So excuse me. Apologies for that. That was my mistake. Okay. And we're going up to the end time, and then we're going to have our I plus plus. Now, if I ever equals query time, so if the query time is ever equal to a time that the student is currently studying at, then we return true. In all of the cases, so right out here, we can return false. Okay, so that's going to be our helper method here. This method is basically just going to take a individual student from these are two arrays and take that individual student and check, is that individual student working at the query time. If they are, so if this returns true back up here, then we want to do that counter, and we want to plus plus that counter. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything. At the end here, the final thing that we need to do, remember we said that we're returning an int here, so we need to return our counter variable. Okay, end that with a semicolon. Okay, so that should be the solution there. Just real quick, going through that again. Busy student takes our two arrays in the query time. We started with creating a counter, and then a for loop that goes through these arrays, takes an individual element of each array, puts those elements into the isBetween method, and in that isBetween method we check, is the query time in between those two times inclusive? If it is, we return true. If it's not, we return false. Up here, if we do return true, we do the counter plus plus, and finally we return the counter. Okay, so to test this out, we can run really quick. We can just do 2 quick integer arrays. We can do our start time array. This will be equal to a new int array and we can set that to, what's a method up here? We'll do 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then int in time, we'll do a new int array, and we'll set this one to, let's see, what's the 1, 2, 3, and 3, 2, 7 is the corresponding one. 3, 2, 7, and we had a query time of 4 for that first example, so we'll do a query time equal to 4. Okay, and now let's plug all of that into our method. So our method's name was busyStudent, so we're going to do a system.out.println busyStudent, and we're going to input all of this data. So start time, end time, query time. Okay, now let's run that, and let's see what we get here. So we should be getting back 1 is our output up here when we put in 1, 2, 3, and 3, 2, 7. And looking down here, it looks like we got back 1. So that worked out exactly right. We can test one more if we want. So that first example used 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 7, and 4. How about we do 4, 4, and 4? So let's do, we only have 1 student this time instead of 3. They started at 4, they ended at 4, and their query time was 4. This should also return back 1. Let's check that. And that did. And let's do 4, 4, and 5, which was example 3. And this should return back 0 because the student started at 4, ended at 4, and the query time was 5, so it should return 0. Okay, and that was 0. And we won't test the last one just because it looks very large. But if you have any questions or any pointers you'd like to point out, please comment in the comments below. I'd love to hear new ways we could optimize this method, new ways we can kind of collaborate on this. And if you like the video, please like and subscribe for more. Thank you very much.